welcome. So this is going to be something new that I'm doing, and in this video I'm going to be looking at a medical study and just talking about it for a little while. This is a common practice in medicine to sort of have a journal club, so why not have one online and just talk about some articles that I've found interesting. You know, I have the electronics hobby that I put out a few videos on, but just between you and me, I don't know if that guy knows what he's talking about. So, I mean, I don't have a background in electronics. I'm just having fun there, and there's a lot of interesting stuff, and I find it fascinating and fun to experiment, to learn about 3D printing, and to learn about all these other strange ideas. But where my education and work experience is basically in looking at medical literature. So this first article is one by a gentleman by the name of Dr. John Cannell, and if I'm pronouncing his name right. He was a general practitioner and I believe a psychiatrist in Kentucky, and for some reason he got interested in vitamin D, and he wrote this review of the epidemiology of vitamin D, and in some ways it sort of reads almost like a detective novel. And to kind of cut to the chase, his conclusion is that the seasonality of influenza is a consequence of the seasonality of blood levels of vitamin D. And this was written in 2008, so this was, you know, he was talking about vitamin D before it was cool to be talking about vitamin D. Personally, I sort of consider it a landmark epidemiological review, and this was the article that turned me on to vitamin D and why I became interested. It also gives one a basis for understanding why people say that vitamin D is helpful to have on board for your immune system being more resistant to bacterial and viral infection. So we'll kind of go over that as well in the article. But rather than me just talking about what we're going to talk about, let's start Journal Club Fridays. And yeah, it's Saturday right now, but wizard is never late, Frodo Baggins. He arrives precisely when he needs to. So I'll try and get them out like every Friday, and then I'll see if I can you know, also do one of the electronics experiments maybe once a week as well. And if people have fun, and especially with the journal club stuff, if they benefit from it, then it's been a success. So without further ado, let's get to the article. So again, greetings, and here is the article. So this is something a little different, but I spent, you know, probably close to 10 years of my life where I just go into work every day and look at medical studies. So I thought maybe I'll pick some that I thought were interesting and well written, and maybe people will also find that interesting as well, and as or more importantly, benefit from it. So I just picked this one to get the ball rolling here, and this is in the journal Virology Journal, and it was accepted in February of 2008, and it is not an epidemiology article, it's a review article on the epidemiology of influenza, but he comes to some rather interesting conclusions that weren't bandied about much at that time. Back in 2008, people weren't making a big hubbub or fuss about vitamin D, as is now pretty universal. So let's just go through this, because it sort of reads almost a bit like a detective novel. And we start with the abstract, and that's just the summary of the article initially. And so we'll go through this very quickly. And he's saying that there's problems with the epidemiology of influenza. It swarms with incongruities, and these were exhaustively detailed by a fellow from Britain, Edgar Hope Simpson, and he is well known for being the first from epidemiological studies to say that there was one virus, one disease for chickenpox and shingles. And then later someone isolated the varicella virus, and I think they won a Nobel Prize for that. So this person then was looking at influenza, and he's saying there's a lot of problems. What's going on with this? It's seemingly unmindful of traditional infectious disease behavioral patterns. Now here's where this gets interesting. So now the authors are saying recent discoveries indicate vitamin D upregulates the endogenous antibiotics of innate immunity, and maybe we can resolve these incongruities that were mentioned by this epidemiologist by considering the epidemiology of vitamin D deficiency. And then they go through 9 conundrums, and later he mentions that 8 of these were brought up by this gentleman, and then they thought of another as well. So why is it seasonal and ubiquitous? Where does it go between epidemics? Normally you would think of some sort of reserve, but it disappears and then reappears each year. Why are the epidemics so explosive? Why do they end abruptly? Why is there a coincidental timing of epidemics in countries of similar latitude? Why is the serial interval obscure? And that is the interval from when one person is come down with the infection to when a subsequent person comes down with the infection. Why is the secondary attack rate so low? Why did previous epidemics spread rapidly even when there wasn't modern transport? Here's an interesting one. Why does experimental inoculation of seronegative humans, people that were not exposed previously to the virus, fail to cause illness in all of the volunteers? It doesn't fail to cause it in all of them, but why doesn't it? Why does it fail to cause it in all of them? It causes it only in some of them, is what I'm saying. Here's an interesting one. Why has influenza mortality of the age not declined as their vaccination rates increased? And then they also discuss recent discoveries in 2008 about vitamin D's effects on innate immunity, and so on and so forth. So we hypothesize that 2 factors explain these 9 conundrums: vitamin D's seasonal and population effects on innate immunity, and the presence of a subpopulation of good infectors. If true, our revision has profound implications for the prevention of influenza. So let's go to the introduction, which is just a more detailed background, and they're just going through some of the previous assumptions, and then he notes that this previous epidemiologist had questioned these. Edgar Hope Simpson actually wrote a book on the problems with influenza and how it wasn't following the characteristic epidemiology of other viruses. And he went further, realizing that solar radiation has profound effects on influenza. He said there must be some sort of unidentified seasonal stimulus for what's going on with how influenza behaves, but he didn't know what the seasonal stimulus might be. So now they just repeat here the 7 questions that were mentioned in the abstract. And here he's talking about an eighth conundrum not addressed by Hope Simpson is that seronegative volunteers, you sometimes can't get them sick. So he's noting a previous study that the percentage of subjects sickened by when they sprayed influenza up their nose was less than 50% in this study, although it depended on how much you sprayed in their nose. And then in another study, only 3 of 8 subjects, the 8 didn't have any pre-existing antibodies. They hadn't seen the bug before, developed illness after inhalation of this particular strain of influenza. And let's see, intranasal administration of various wild viruses to seronegative only resulted in constitutional symptoms 60% of the time. And then I thought this was interesting. Inoculation with Fort Dix swine virus, H1N1, a virus thought to be similar to the 1918 virus, in 6 seronegative volunteers failed to produce any serious illness, with 1 volunteer suffering moderate, 3 mild, 1 very mild, and 1 no illness at all. That's kind of interesting because the swine flu of 1918, you could argue that it ended World War I and it killed tens of millions of people. So, it was crazy researchers. They just sprayed it up 6 people's nose. And it didn't do much. It wasn't the disaster that it was in 1918. So that's kind of strange, isn't it? And then similar studies on H1N1 viruses, 46 of 55 directly inoculated failed to develop constitutional symptoms. So they couldn't get them sick even if they tried. If influenza is highly infectious, why doesn't direct inoculation of a novel virus cause universal illness? And here he brings up another conundrum, and I'm going to do my best not to get off topic. A ninth conundrum, evident only recently, that epidemiologic studies about vaccine effectiveness, contrary to randomized clinical trials, for example, influenza mortality and hospitalization rates for older Americans significantly increased in the 1980s and 1990s during the same time that influenza vaccination rates for elderly Americans dramatically increased. Even when aging of the population is accounted for, so they stratified on that variable, death rates of the most immunized age group did not decline, and that's another study. Rizzo et al. Studying Italian elderly concluded, we found no evidence of reduction in influenza-related mortality in the last 15 years, despite vaccination coverage going from 10 to 60%. So this is sort of unrelated to his main point, but he's saying, why aren't increasing vaccination rates translating into decreasing illness? So while I don't want to get too far off topic, I can't leave that entirely alone. And I would just say, before the high-speed, off-the-rails, flaming manure train that was the global inoculation program for COVID, there, in general, the vaccinations weren't entirely deadly, but there were reasonable arguments about, is this doing any good or not? And there's a lot of interesting historical articles that maybe we can get into on that, as well as looking at some of the more recent stuff, although it's painful to talk about some of the recent stuff. But where am I going with that? Well, one of the issues there is that even when they went to to actually approve an inoculation, to do the work to get it approved and do valid long-term safety studies and things like that. They were often approved based upon what's called a surrogate marker for disease. And in the case of the vaccinations, it was often sufficient to just show that after you gave the vaccination, there was an increase in antibody levels against the particular virus. That is problematic, though. And it's problematic because you have to keep in mind disease is something defined by signs and symptoms. So symptoms being someone comes in and say, I'm feeling bad, I have a headache. And signs being, oh, you're feverish and I can hear a cough, and when I use the stethoscope I can hear that your lungs are clogged. But the marker of having increased antibodies to a particular virus is not necessarily the same as saying that there's a decrease in that disease. And so it's a bit more expensive, for one, and more time consuming to give an inoculation to tens of thousands of people while it's being developed, and seeing, well, what's the rate of that versus people that weren't developed. And so there's been a reliance on this surrogate marker that frequently comes about, even in the approval process, if they still do that sort of thing anymore. So, like, to use a really silly example of a surrogate marker, one could have, say, a very malnourished person who goes into the doctor's office, and the doctor puts him on the scale, and he looks at him and he says, you know, I've looked at your height, and I'm looking at the numbers on the scale, and these numbers are too low. I must tell you, these numbers are too low. Now what I'm going to do, I have these, they have Velcro on them, it'll be easy. I have these two 10-pound ankle weights. Now I want you to put them on, and I want you to come back to me in 2 weeks, and we're going to see what's on the scale, and I bet you it's going to be better, and you can thank me later. So I'm very sorry, but we're going to correct this problem. So that's a silly example, although, you know, sometimes not. Sometimes it's not, especially where things are at now. It's hard to find silly examples. But of, you know, where you have a problem with a surrogate marker, I'd like to give another. Here's a more real world one, and I haven't kept up to date on this, but for the disease of osteopenia, and this is a good one because vitamin D was initially discovered because a severe deficiency of vitamin D leads to the disease called rickets, which are weak and malformed bones. And vitamin D was first known for a long time to be something that regulated calcium metabolism and allowed the body to utilize calcium efficiently. And only more recently, as Dr. Cannell, you know, said, this is a steroid hormone that's involved in thousands of reactions, and we'll get into that. I'm getting off topic, but to get to the point there, so they developed. So people would go in and they would do what's called a bone density scan. They would take an X-ray and look at a bone, and they'd say, "My gosh, this bone it doesn't have a good density. It's too transparent and too thin. We need to correct that." And they would give these drugs called bisphosphonates. I need to see if they're still giving them. And sure enough, the bisphosphonates would lead to more bone being laid down. But the bone that was laid down was often malformed. It wasn't good bone, and the bisphosphonates, in fact, will harm the osteoclasts and osteoblasts responsible for maintaining bone health. So I need to see if those things are still on the market. But that's like another sort of disaster that's been occurring, or hopefully it's all in the past now, where you're not really getting any benefit. You're just treating a value, sort of like the person asking someone to wear leg weights so that they can get the scale up. And again, I think that one came to mind just because vitamin D allows one to make efficient use of calcium. And as people get older, you actually don't want a lot of calcium, especially if you don't have a lot of magnesium on board. So it's good to have vitamin D to have strong bones as well without having too much calcium, which can cause problems with, calcium scans of the heart and so on and so forth. Let me stop and get this train back on the tracks. So for the rest of this page, he's sort of bringing up more questions. Why have epidemic patterns in Great Britain not altered over 4 centuries, even though people travel between countries much more easily now? If each successive epidemic increases herd immunity, children born since the last epidemic are not immune, why doesn't the average age of persons infected in successive epidemics become lower? Why did the peak of 25 consecutive epidemics in France and the USA occur within a mean of 4 days of each other? Then he's just saying that close interaction does propagate influenza. It can be propagated by aerosols and droplets. And so here he's just sort of talking about, how does this propagate? And we know what the incubation period is, but we're not really sure what the serial interval, between the first case and subsequent cases really is. And is this spreading from droplets on a shelf, or is it from other sick people? And just talking about that. But then he starts in on what he's saying, that there may be carriers that are briefly called into contagious by this seasonal stimulus. That's what Hope Simpson was saying. And here we start to get to the heart of the paper. And this is something that I don't think many people were saying at the time. But he's saying perhaps this seasonal stimulus that Hope Simpson was talking about is vitamin D. And to buttress that, he's saying recent evidence suggests it could be impairments of the anti-microbial peptide systems crucial to innate immunity, and that these impairments are caused by dramatic seasonal fluctuations in the levels of vitamin D. So, along with the more commonly talked about parts of the immune system, there's also these anti-microbial peptides that are regulated, and if you don't have enough vitamin D on board, you don't make as many of them. So, and he's saying here, and recall this back in 2008, it's there have been many more confirmational studies since then. The evidence that vitamin D has profound effects on innate immunity is rapidly growing. So here are just some interesting studies from back then that he was going over. There was a post hoc analysis of the side effect questions of their randomized control trial. They found 104 African American women given vitamin D were 3 times less likely to report cold and flu symptoms than 104 placebo controls. 800 international units a day, a low dose, not only reduced reported incidence, it abolished the seasonality of reported colds and flu. A higher dose, 2,000 international units a day, which is still not that high, given during the last year of their trial, virtually eradicated all reports of cold and flu. So if there was one take-home message that I would leave with people, it's that line, that this was, granted it was post-hoc analysis, but of a previous randomized control trial. We won't go into the issues of why post-hoc analysis is problematic, but a higher dose, 2,000 international units, virtually eradicated all reports of cold and flu. And so saying it's the antibiotic vitamin due to its effects on innate immunity. And so there's a distinction between adaptive immunity, the humoral arm, which is the antibodies by the B cells, and I'm not an immunologist, but you know, there's some degree of overlap, and then innate immunity, which, you know, at a base level you think of macrophages going around cleaning up messes, and killer T cells and things like that. But again, you know, there's some degree of overlap, but the adaptive immunity is the thing that has a memory. That's the thing where after you've gotten sick, as long as your adaptive immunity isn't messed up then by something, then you will develop a good immunity over time. I mean, most kids figure this out by the time they're in elementary school. I got over it, now I'm not going to get it again. So that's the adaptive immunity. And he's just going a little bit more about that, but here he's talking again about these antimicrobial peptides, and he's saying the phagocytic, the white blood cells, produce these also, and they exhibit rapid and broad spectrum antimicrobial. I'm going to leave you hanging for a minute, because this is a good figure here. And this is a study of the average blood levels of vitamin D by month in Britain in 1958 British cohort. And so you can see the vitamin D levels just plummet. They reach the bottom there in January and February, and then they go back up. And there's broad swing in the vitamin D levels. And then he's saying up here that, you know, it's not just about bone health anymore, that there are these antimicrobial peptides, and there's lots of other things that it does that we know about now too, but that there's this broad swing. And, you know, just to be clear, the reason that is when you're in the higher latitudes, like Britain, the angle of the sun going through, I probably should have started with this at some point, but you don't just get vitamin D from the diet. You do get vitamin D from the diet, but that's not the only place. You, of course, also make vitamin D when you get sun on your skin. And what happens is the ultraviolet radiation comes in and it converts cholesterol in the skin into vitamin D. One of the reasons, you know, like, oh my gosh, 2,000 units a day. If you go out and lay on the beach in the summer, in about a half hour, you'll make 20,000 units of vitamin D. So it's not, that's not a large dose at all, 2,000. So where am I going with this? That in the wintertime, the angle of the sun is such that the ultraviolet radiation can't get through. And so if you can't get a tan, then you're not making vitamin D. And so the vitamin D plummets. Now, he probably talks about it, so I'll shut up about that for the moment. But if not, there's, you know, another interesting thing. Well, I'll just mention it now, and then he'll probably talk about it too. But you can see, like, I imagine Britain is basically like a Roman colony of people from the Mediterranean. And when you have people that have lived a long time in a particular area, they kind of adapt to it. And so, you know, if you have like the Eskimos, what do they eat? They eat fish all the time. And what's a good source of vitamin D? Fish oil, cod liver oil. for a while they were just giving all of the British kids cod liver oil because it was so helpful to them, and that's another good way to get vitamin D. If you're like, these pills, they're too unnatural, just take some cod liver oil, or eat a bunch of, salmon would be great, but it doesn't have to be salmon. So there are a number of foods, fish included, that have a lot of vitamin D in them. And so you see even the Nordic people and Eskimos, their diet is different than the diet with the British. And so the British would often get sick because they basically still had a Mediterranean diet, going back to if they were sort of their backgrounds perhaps not being from that area for that long a time. All right, let's drive on. I'm sort of rambling here. So here's sort of a graphic representation of the data that he was talking about before. That this is reported incidences of cold and influenza symptoms, and this big line is people who didn't have any vitamin Z supplementation. This one is people who are taking 800 units a day, and as he said, there was only one person taking 2,000 units a day that ever reported symptoms out of the 104, and it happened there. So you can see it's a pretty dramatic difference, and in the spring and the summer, go back to here, there wasn't a difference, and in the winter it was ginormous. So now he's switching, we're switching back to these anti-microbial peptides. Sounds pretty high tech. And they have antimicrobial activity against bacteria, fungi, and viruses. In general, they act by rapidly, well, even if we go back a little bit more, proteins are made of amino acids, and if you have a very long string of proteins, long string of amino acids strung together, that's a protein. If you just have a short string, then you call that a polypeptide or a peptide. So these are just these short strings of amino acid that are targeted against bacteria, fungi, and viruses. They act by rapidly and irreversibly damaging the lipoprotein membranes of microbial targets, including envelope viruses like influenza. And so he's pointing out that there's a good mechanism of action for why they're seeing this in the epidemiology and the randomized controlled trial. He's saying, to effectively access the epithelium, influenza must penetrate the mucus barrier and then survive the damage inflicted by the AMPs present in the fluid that is in immediate contact. And if it gets past that, the expression of high concentrations of specific inducible means they have one specific for that bug, and that you can upregulate it and downregulate it. And he mentions two of them here, beta defensin 2 and cathelicidin, provide a backup shield. And they also, these inducible AMPs also act as chemoattractants for macrophages, telling the white blood cells, get over here, we got work to do, and neutrophils that are present in the immediate vicinity. The cathelicidins play a role in epithelial repair as well. So there's a clear mechanism of action there for influenza. I wonder what other viruses might also be enveloped viruses. Well, one of them I know, that just as the influenza virus has a lipid envelope that's being destroyed by these AMPs, the whole class of coronaviruses are enveloped viruses. So I don't know, just off the top of my head, say there was some sort of terrible outbreak, let's call it coronavirus 23. If you didn't want to get coronavirus 23, or if you wanted to have a good outcome, you would probably want to have a lot of vitamin D on board so that your white blood cells and your epithelial cells can shoot all these AMPs at the envelope of that coronavirus, wouldn't you think? So that's another thing. Coronaviruses are envelope viruses, and the whole suppression of early treatments and just common sense things. I'm not going to get too far afield, but I'll just say greed and incompetence can take you pretty far into a bad place. But it was so silly that you start to wonder what the heck was really going on with that whole program. But again, the vitamin D makes these AMPs, and the AMPs wreak havoc on envelope viruses. So, you want to have enough on board. You don't want to bring a knife to a gunfight. And this was all only discovered recently at that time. And then this is also an important point. He's saying in the macrophage, that's the big tank that goes around chewing up the bad guys, the presence of vitamin D suppresses pro-inflammatory cytokines, these ones, and downregulates these receptors. And so the point being that, where is it? It dampens certain parts of the immune system that are responsible for signs and symptoms of acute inflammation, such as the cytokine storms that are operative when influenza kills quickly. So with a severe influenza like the 1918 one, oftentimes the younger were having worse outcomes than the older, and that's because it wasn't the virus per se. I mean, of course it was, but the proximate cause was that the immune response was so over the top to the virus that the immune response was harming the patient and weakening them. So vitamin D really does two good things. It improves the efficiency of the killing of the virus, and it stops the immune system from overreacting to the virus, and so you don't have as much of a chance of developing one of these cytokine storms, as they're called, which are very bad. And this has also led to a lot of research that we can't start on here, but in terms of vitamin D to help treat autoimmune diseases where your body is mistakenly mounting an immune response to some component of healthy tissue, and vitamin D does to some extent help to tamp down that process, and maybe that's a topic for another time. And here he's noting that animals like the mouse, rat, and dog lack a vitamin D receptor binding site, and they don't really have this whole system. So you can't extrapolate the role of vitamin D from studies in commonly used lab animals. And then here he's talking about that in African Americans, plasma vitamin D levels tend to be lower than in white-skinned individuals. So for people who have lived around the equator for a long time, they tend to be darker skinned because there's a trade-off that's occurring. If you are out in a strong sun for a while, you'll notice that your skin becomes burned, and the way you protect that is by increasing the melanin level in the skin. And so for lighter skinned people, you see that they get darker skin or a tan. And the melanin also has you make less vitamin D for a given amount of sunlight. And so you see for people, say in Nordic countries, they're very light skinned, so that when the sun is there, they can make efficient use and make a lot of vitamin D. Whereas for people near the equator, they don't want their skin being burnt, and so they have a baseline higher level of melanin, but they get more sun unless they move to Norway. And so that's something that especially darker skinned people should keep in mind if they're in a higher latitude. So it shields the keratinocytes from the ultraviolet radiation that's required to generate vitamin D in the skin. Melanin, that is. And here he's just pointing out that even around the equator, some people still have vitamin D deficiency, maybe because they're avoiding the sun, or there's a rainy season, or air pollution. And there's a study with Hong Kong infants that nearly half of them were vitamin D deficient in the winter, and so on and so forth. I've been talking for a while. I'm going to skip a lot of this now. So here he's talking more about trying to get sick to well human transmission. Talking more about that. What else? And here he's talking again about the serial interval. Let's skip that. And here he's talking about the secondary rate. Let's skip that. I mean, you should read all this, but I'm pressed for time because I don't want this to go for 3 hours. Animal studies. Let's just go right to the discussion. So here he's saying that, Hope Simpson thought, well, maybe there are people who carry the disease year-round, but then there's just some seasonal stimulus in the wintertime that makes them infectious. He's saying, no one's been able to find that it's latent, similar to, chickenpox, which, of course, Hope Simpson was familiar with, which can reactivate to shingles. But there's no evidence that influenza does that. But he's saying that you don't need that when you consider vitamin D's effects on the immune system. That the marked variation is related to vitamin D deficiency, and that explains that problem. And let's skip these. What explains the frequent coincidental timing in countries of similar latitudes? And again, it's due to seasonal sunlight deprivation leading to the changes in vitamin D levels, and that's why the epidemics in France and America would peak at the same time and then go away in the spring. Why is this? Let's skip this. Let's talk a little bit about this. Why does experimental inoculation of seronegative humans fail to cause consistent illness? If it's highly infectious, although the rate does depend on how much virus you hit them with, we propose individual variations in the vitamin D levels explain some degree of the variations in illness response. So I'm not someone who's, there are no viruses, and so on and so forth. But when you look at this from a slightly different angle, you can sort of say, what exactly is the disease? Is the influenza pathogen the disease? And now keep in mind, yes, the influenza pathogen is causing the signs and symptoms of disease. So I would say that sort of is the disease. And the immune system has a whole toolbox, not just innate immunity, but adaptive immunity, so that, it says, well, that was a bad character. If we ever see that again, we got to be ready. And, that's the whole antibody arm of things. But you can look at it from a slightly different angle, and you could sort of say, well, is the disease an impaired immune system? And the immune system is not functioning optimally because there is not sufficient vitamin D. There's not high enough levels of this steroid hormone for the immune system to function optimally, and that a consequence of that is the frequent appearance of influenza. But
I don't want to go too far there. I mean, influenza is the disease, I would say, but you can also kind of look at it a little bit like, well, it's also a consequence of an impaired immune system. But again, there's some kind of wacky stuff out there too. But later on we'll kind of discuss some kind of wacky articles too. So you don't want to be entirely dismissive of everything unless you just get the impression the person is like being purposely strange. And then here he's talking again that, well, the vaccines don't seem to be working. And why is that? And saying, well, maybe people are avoiding the sun. That's a whole nother can of worms. Let's just leave that leave that out for now. And so here he just sort of summarizes the things that were talked about previously. And I guess, sort of the take-home message is, if you're in a northern latitude in the winter, you should be taking a minimum, in my view, of 2,000 international units of vitamin D a day. Now, oddly, I think the last I checked, they still have a maximum, how do they put it, like maximum tolerable dose or something like that of 4,000 units a day, which is absolutely absurd. If you're a roofer in California in summer, then you're going to be making 20,000 or more than 20,000 units of vitamin D a day. But for whatever reason, the science hasn't caught up with what has been demonstrated in the literature. But I won't tell you to take 5,000 units a day in winter. I do. I sometimes forget, so it probably averages out to like 2,500 a day. That's another thing, that vitamin D doesn't have a real short half-life. So, if you're out in the sun for one day, you're making 20,000 units, you're good for a few days. So where am I going with this? And, I won't say to do this, but if I, have some sniffles, I'll take 10, 15, 20,000 units of vitamin D in a day and continue that if I want to for 2 or 3 days, although that and a couple other things after a day, it's usually a day or two, it's whatever it is pretty much no longer there. But at 2,000 units of vitamin D a day, that's still going to make a big difference in the wintertime. Now, in the summer, again, if you're getting outside and it's clear weather and things like that, you don't need to worry about it. Don't go from 20,000 to 25,000 units a day, of course. But in the winter, if you have zero, then take 2,000 or 4,000, and it's a benefit to your health. So I want to wrap it up soon, but I'll just sort of a few more things, and then we'll wrap it up. I know at one time I kind of looked into, what are in sunscreens, and it's not regulated hardly at all. And some of them look like they really wouldn't be very good for you to be putting on your skin. Although the American College of Dermatology is always, slather this on once every 30 minutes, even though it's like 50 different substances, half of them uncharacterized, and oftentimes with, very little toxicity data at all. There are even some people that speculate the increase in melanoma rates is because of all the darn sunscreen. So I'm not saying don't use sunscreen, but I am saying that if you use sunscreen, be sure to look first at what's in it, because I'm not certain that all of it, or even the majority of it, is safe to be putting on your skin frequently. And there's also, especially you get this from the American College of Dermatology, like, sun bad, stay in basement, do not go out without sunscreen and full covering. Nonsense. Sun good, sun not bad. Good day, sunshine. There's certain things that are, if your skin makes you go ouch, then get out of the sun or cover your skin. You know, there's certain things that it's just the advice is oftentimes so moronic that I don't mean to. Well, I do mean to talk that way because the advice is often so moronic that the sun is your enemy. No, the sun is good. Sun is good. Fresh air is good. Exercise is good. All these things are very good for your health. But of course, don't partake of the sun where it's causing you pain. There's a reason why sunburn hurts. So use common sense. But vitamin D deficiency is certainly a factor that leads to potentially many problems, and one is an impairment of an efficient immune response that is also not overly, you're not worrying about, it's not overly inflammatory, and you're not worrying about a cytokine storm or something like that. And very last thing, if you're someone that I won't take any pill, this is all unnatural, well, take some cod liver oil in the wintertime then. It's the same thing. I mean, a teaspoon of cod liver oil I think is about 1,000 units of vitamin D and some vitamin A as well. Or if you want, just eat a lot of fish. That probably won't be quite enough, but it would certainly make a big difference, and you would be having a diet similar to the Nordic countries and the Eskimos who eat a lot of fish naturally and are plagued with much less seasonality of things like influenza than the British. So even just by altering your diet, you can make a big difference. But the easiest thing is, just take 2,000, 4,000 units a day in wintertime. So let's wrap this one up here. I think I've talked long enough. I hope people enjoyed this first Journal Club article, and it's freely available online. I mean, you can see the link there, but I'll post that in the description as well. And any article that I talk about, I'll make sure that it's one that the full text is, well, I think 90% of the time. I'll try to make sure that the full text is always available, as it is with this one. So there are lots of resources on vitamin D that one can find. It's something that people talk a lot more about now, but I just kind of wanted to go back towards the beginning, when people were just looking at, wow, this is really associated with infectious disease, and the take-home message is just that vitamin D is good for improving the immune system's ability to fight off bacteria and viruses. And so you don't want to be deficient in vitamin D. It does lots of other things too. There's like a dozen things you could talk about just with vitamin D. One of them that's interesting, maybe I'll try and do an article on that. It helps very frequently with musculoskeletal pain. So if people have a lot of low back pain or something, I suspect it's related to its ability to tamp down the inflammatory response of the immune system. But it's beneficial in many areas. One of the things I'd like to look at with vitamins, I'll have to see if I can get the information, but I am fairly certain, and I'll have to look at it, that with vitamin D, when you look at just overall mortality, when you have a normal to a high level of vitamin D, you have less overall mortality. So it's sort of like you get the benefits and the side effects is you live longer. Um, you know, I'm pretty sure it has effects on telomeres too, if I recall correctly. That's all for another time. So the take-home message is the weather is getting nice now with the springtime, and my prescription as a doctor is to get out and enjoy the sun. Don't get a sunburn, but enjoy the sun. And if you can't do that, then take some vitamin D. Thanks for listening, and I hope people enjoyed this and found it beneficial. If you like, hit the like button if you liked it and enjoyed it or found it beneficial, and subscribe, and feel free to comment. It's always nice to get a comment or two. And I think I screwed up with, I don't know what I'm doing with the YouTube and the video logging and all that. I think I had the comments blocked for a while, but I don't think that's the case. And so, if you want to comment on anything or say, oh, you're wrong about that, then that's great too. So again, hope people enjoyed it, and ciao for now. Bye-bye.